Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak to you today and to explain to you what we're doing in Brussels in relation to this very important and quite challenging subject. What I'd like to talk to you about today is firstly to give you a bit of an overview about the Paris Agreement, explain what it is that this agreement is and what it does. Then to talk what this means in terms of the EU policy, the EU climate and energy policy, and what it is that we are seeking to achieve there. And then to go down into talking what the implications and the consequences are in relation to renewable energy and in transport and the decarbonisation of transport. So, the Paris Agreement. Before Christmas, you can't have missed the fact that we had a very important agreement agreed after many years of negotiation. From an EU perspective, we worked very hard with the member states to achieve this, and we're very pleased by the outcome because it basically we achieved a substantial amount of our objectives at the EU level in terms of the final agreement that came out. So we see this as a really big success. What is it that the agreement does? What I've tried to do here is actually really focus in on the key bits, the so what. This agreement is very important because it's the first legally binding agreement that's universal around the world. The previous agreement, Kyoto, was only binding in relation to developed countries. This is a global framework, so this is really important. The other thing, another aspect of it which is very important, is it sets out a globally agreed long-term goal in terms of what we're trying to achieve in climate change. This is often referred to as a 2 degrees C target, or at least 2 degrees C. So it's actually a recognition around the world, or consensus, that we need to have achieve a certain level of ambition in relation to climate change. It also sets up a process. It's basically the start of a cycle. This agreement isn't a sort of endpoint, it's really the start of a journey because it's starting up a sort of 5-year review cycle by which all the countries continue to talk to each other and continue to pledge what they're going to do in terms of reducing emissions to achieve the global target. Very importantly, there are agreed elements in there about transparency. This is basically about data. We have to be able to measure progress. We have to be able to see what's been achieved in different countries, understand what's happening with emissions. So we need transparency and accountability to make sure that everyone's playing the game and everyone is doing what they said they were set out to do. And finally, there's also some very important support for developing countries. This was absolutely critical in terms of getting the global agreement, because one of the biggest debates over recent years was basically poor countries saying to rich countries, you created this problem and now you're asking us to pay for it. So therefore the sort of the support mechanisms to ensure that rich countries help poor countries in this transition was a really key part of this agreement. So those are the key elements to it. What does this mean in terms of timetable? The agreement is due to be signed very soon, and that sort of kicks off the first process. What we have in terms of so far is we have an EU commitment in terms of targets for 2030, which is a contribution to staying below the 2 degrees target. So that's a way that we're going into the signing of the agreement. Then we start off with an assessment process, this sort of 5-year cycle of pledging and reviewing. So 2018, the target is to have basically a global review, stock take as it says up here, in terms of understanding what is the progress, what is the trajectory, and how close are we to meeting the goals going forward. This will mean that by 2020, all the contracting parties should be reviewing their commitments. This word is INDC, Intended Nationally Determined Contribution it stands for. But basically this is the emissions pledges that each country is making. And there's we have an EU-wide pledge that I'll talk a little bit more about on later slides. And so the idea is that we have this process there's a sort of pledge and review, a continual process in countries making pledges, reviewing how this meets the 2 degrees C target, and then if it's not sufficient, a further round of pledges takes place. So this is the sort of process that we are in. Where are we now? What does this mean? This is global emissions. This is trying to show you the scale of the challenge that we have ahead of us. Basically, this breaks into 3 broad trajectories. Firstly, the top 2 are business as usual, effectively. What happens if we have no action in terms of the emission levels? And what does this mean in terms of temperature changes? So with no action, you can see that we're in a sort of 4 to 5 degrees change in temperature forecast by those levels of emissions. The blue lines are the pledges, these INDCs, which were made in the run-up to Paris in terms of when you add together all the contributions by all the countries around the world, where are we heading? There are 2 lines there because many pledges are sort of conditioned in that they have a sort of, countries have gone in with a range. We'll definitely do this, but we may go further and do a bit more. So we've got a high-low, which is shown up there in terms of the dark blue and the light blue line. But what you're seeing now is that it's already clear from an EU perspective, because we were very active in crunching this data, that the pledges are not sufficient for the long-term goal, because we're on a trajectory towards 3 degrees. To get to a maximum 2 degrees, we need to be towards the green line. So the message from that I'm trying to say is that with Paris, we've already got people to come from the red and the yellow down towards the blue, but with the pledge and review process, we need to get this down to the green. So that's what's going to be happening in the years ahead. What's this mean for the EU? What I've got here is basically showing what has to happen for the EU to contribute towards that 2 degrees goal. Basically, we are in a process of transitioning to a substantial decarbonisation of our economy. If we're serious about meeting that goal, we have to reduce our emissions by 2050 in the order of 80% from 1990 levels. So you can see that's where we're heading. So to help us on that path, we've set interim goals, and you may be familiar with the interim goals, and we have a agreed 20% reduction for 2020 and a 40% reduction for 2030. So this is a design to put us on this trajectory. The yellow is the sort of projections of what we think existing policy measures are going to deliver in Europe, and showing that to meet we're fine for the 2020 levels, we meet the 20% reduction target, but it shows that to reach our 2030 targets, more policy is needed to help drive that emission reduction. I think it's also important to demonstrate that Europe's actually been quite successful at emissions reduction so far, in terms of there's been a long-term association that emissions equals economic development equals growth. What I've tried to attempt to show here is basically show how since 1990 we have been progressively decoupling the emissions from GDP. So the GDP is the top line, showing how the economy's developed over those years, and the emissions is shown in the red, and effectively our emissions per unit of GDP is shown by the green line. So you can see that we're on this consistent downward path in that we're actually growing and reducing emissions. So that we see this as a really good success in showing that we can decarbonise our economy going forward. I said I'd talk a bit about the EU goals. Some of you may be familiar with this, but I think this is a really useful slide to summarise what it is that's been agreed at a political level in terms of targets. So we're currently working under what we call the 2020 framework, which was agreed a few years ago and has been embedded in all our current legislation, which is providing a legal framework to achieve the 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, to increase renewable energy use to 20%, and also to improve energy efficiency by 20% in 2020. So those are the headline goals which we are working with in our current policy framework delivers. What we're now focusing on in terms of reviewing legislation is our new set of goals. And these are the 2030 goals, and these are the ones which were agreed politically by the heads of government in the EU and formed the basis of our contribution for the Paris Agreement. So this is what we went to Paris saying we would deliver. This is 40% GHG, as I showed on the previous graph, and then at least 27% renewable energy and 27% energy efficiency. The interconnection stuff is just electricity at the side. It's important for the electricity system, but not so important when we're talking in relation to transport. And we're also working on a new governance system for this with the member states in terms of making this work and having, sharing out the contributions across Europe. I put this slide in because I thought this might be particularly interesting for this audience. It may be slightly complicated because it's sort of showing two things at the same time. Basically, the top set of bars are showing what we are forecasting is going to happen to energy consumption in Europe from the modelling that we've been doing around these commitments. And so you can see that we're looking to see that we should have a reduction in energy consumption due to energy efficiency over time. That's the solid blue. Then the charts below is actually showing the various contributions to that energy consumption and how our energy sources are going to transition and change over time. And so, for example, you can see clearly that as we get energy efficiency, we're going to have a reduction in the total energy use in the EU. You can see that the green bar, which is renewable energy, is increasing. And the one with most notable decrease is solid fuels, such as coal, where we're forecasting that quite a substantial reduction in coal consumption will take place. So you can see that this is a transition. This is forecast to be a transition, and each fuel type is effectively going to be is going to respond in slightly different ways in terms of the way that we're going to achieve our overall 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, what this is really reflecting is that in the short term, the big focus is going to be on the electricity sector. It's going to be basically replacing fossil generation with renewable generation because it's a very cost-effective form of decarbonisation. That's really what the trend that you're seeing there. So it's a bit more of a nuanced picture when you're dealing with transportation because that is basically the sort of the oil products which dominate in the transport sector. I thought it's also very important, as well as talking about headline targets, to talk about the Energy Union, because this is the major political initiative under the current Commission in terms of energy policy. The Energy Union embraces all the headline targets that I talked about, but basically it's a political project of our President of the Commission who sees there is a big need to reform the energy market in Europe, basically make the energy system in Europe better. It reflects that we have multiple objectives for energy. We need security of supply, we need sustainability, we need decarbonisation. We need it to be cost effective, we need it to retain industrial competitiveness, and consumers have to be able to afford it. So we see these as multiple objectives, but they're not incompatible. We're going to be seeking to deliver all of these together. So you can see that this means that we have to act on a range of different areas in terms of energy efficiency, market integration, security of supply, and sort of keeping up sort of research, innovation, and competitiveness. So it's resulted in a program which is really directing the work that we're doing in Brussels at the moment in terms of a series of actions and initiatives which have all been detailed in terms of delivering this vision. So that's just a very important framework which is sort of setting the parameters for our work. I also wanted to flag up or to highlight another very important driver of energy policy, and the council conclusions, the council conclusions are basically the conclusions from the meetings of heads of government, the heads of state, the presidents, the prime ministers. And so when they meet and discuss on certain issues, the meeting will be concluded by publicly available documents where they set out their vision. So this is some conclusions from last year in terms of transportation, and I pulled these out because I thought they were particularly interesting for this audience. The council conclusions basically set the political direction. In other words, they instruct the Commission in terms of where we should be focusing and what, make requests for the work that we should be doing. So again, they form a very important political instruction for us. So here, I think it's clear that the prime ministers and presidents are asking us to decarbonise the transport sector. They're asking us to look at ways to reduce emissions, improve efficiency. They're also wanting a vision and strategy in relation to the electrification of transport and the increase in renewable energy in transport. So those are very clear sort of message that we've been given in terms of our work going forward. What does this mean concretely? So taking into consideration the targets that we've got, the energy union, the instructions we get politically from the leaders. This is a list of the legislation or some of the legislation, it's not comprehensive, but it's the most relevant bits of legislation, which the Commission is currently working on and due to publish and come out with new proposals in 2016. So it's actually quite a big legislative programme. So the first three bits are the bits which are due to come out sort of third quarter of this year, and the bottom three are at the end of the year. So the effort sharing directive is very important because it's basically setting, it's for the non-emissions traded sectors in terms of the allocation and attribution of binding greenhouse gas targets to member states. And this is very important for the transport sector because most transport emissions are outside of the ETS. So it's basically setting a framework by which each country is agreeing to how much responsibility they will take for achieving our overall targets. So that's a very live and active discussion. We're also working on a communication of transport decarbonisation. This is very much reflecting the council request. This is a political document. It's not a piece of legislation. It's just really a vision. It's terms of sort of setting the strategy and where we should be going. But that will be very important in terms of outlining how we see transport decarbonisation taking place in the coming years. The energy efficiency legislation is due for an update. The vehicle efficiency CO2 of cars is due for an update. We're reforming our electricity market, which is going to be important for to enable future electrification of transport. We also have the renewables directive is due for review as well, and that's going to be very important in relation to biofuel policy. And I mentioned a little bit about we've got this new governance framework, which is more as an internal thing about how member states and the Commission report data and show their performance to each other and to the Commission. So it's a lot going on, and a lot, when you put all this together, which will really shape the framework towards 2030 for transport and fuels. So it's early days. Just wanted to then now go into a little bit about renewable energy, just to show where we've come from. I think this is quite nice to show. It shows actually that we've made quite a lot of progress over recent years in terms of increasing renewable energy use in the European economy. We're now at 16%. I think that's 2013 data, because there's always a time lag in terms of the data coming out. We're heading towards 20% for 2020, and then 27% is the target for 2030. So you can see that we've seen quite a change in terms of renewable consumption, and going forward, I think some of the big areas which are expected to contribute to the increases are going to be the dark blue and the yellow, which is the solar and the photovoltaic electricity, in terms of this very significant growth in those forecasts. I also wanted to I just threw this in really just to demonstrate what we see as the role of renewables policy. This is more electricity focus, but it basically shows that there's been significant cost reductions in renewable electricity, particularly on wind and photovoltaic. And we see that policy has been very, very important in driving those cost reductions. Basically, economies of scale and making these things mass market has been very important in pushing the costs down. So we see that one of the core roles of renewable energy legislation is to carry on with this path and bring the costs of these down to the best possible levels. I mean, we're now at a stage with photovoltaics that photovoltaics in many parts of the world is the cheapest way of generating electricity, which is quite incredible. I mean, it's cheaper. I think it's quite incredible progress compared to the way people perceive this technology and what's happened over recent years. So now that something like that's mass market and it's the cheapest, it shows that there's a potential for radical change in terms of the way the energy system or the electricity system will be functioning going forward. So, just to finish up, I'll just highlight what it is that I'm working on and our team's doing in relation to the Renewable Energy Directive. The core focus of this piece of legislation is we need to have the legislation create a framework to ensure that we achieve our 27% renewable energy target at EU level by 2030. So we're putting together a legal framework to do that. That's basically going to result in continued focus on three areas. It's about renewable electricity, it's about the heating and cooling, and it's about transport, and looking to see how we can appropriately integrate or increase renewable energy use in all three of those sectors. And then the other cross-cutting that is another very important component of our policy is the sort of removal of administrative barriers and increasing the use of consumer power to help drive the energy transition. So I can't really say very much more than that because we haven't really got any proposals, or it's still very much work in progress in terms of what we're going to be doing. But this is something by the end of this year we should come out with some more concrete ideas in terms of what we're going to be doing there. So just to conclude, I think what I've been trying to show with this presentation is that the Paris Agreement has been very important in terms of setting the framework for our policies. We're in a process of embedding those 2030 targets into legislation because that's what we committed to do under Paris. There's no immediate review of those targets, but the way the Paris Agreement is working, a further pledge or a further tightening of those targets may be needed. But it's too early to say. We have to see how that works out. But it's a few years down the road it's possible that that tightening will work. It's also, I think, important to highlight that decarbonisation of transport is seen as a very high political priority, and we have been asked to do a substantial amount of work on it to try and work out the best way forward for Europe. And some of that will come out in the Renewable Energy Directive, which is due at the end of this year. So, thank you.